Hi there, everyone. My name's Ava Lorenc, and I'm here to talk to you today about some current perspectives on complementary medicine research. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my experiences and kind of things I've come across in my career so far that hopefully might be helpful for anyone considering doing research in this area. So I'm a senior research associate at the University of Bristol, and I'm one of the supervisors for the research project module at NCA. I'll just give you a little bit of background before I get started on the slides. I started off in complementary therapies at the University of Westminster, where I did my BSc back when they had quite a few different courses running. And that's really where I got interested in doing research during my year 3 dissertation project module. And from there, I was lucky enough to obtain a funded post at Thames Valley University to do my PhD. That was alongside Professor Nicola Robinson. And I looked at children's use of complementary and traditional approaches, so things like home remedies. It's in quite a multi-ethnic area, using qualitative methods there. I then went on to London South Bank University to work as a research associate on various projects and different types of complementary medicine, using review methods, qualitative methods, and survey methods. Then made the move to Bristol, where I got a post as a senior research associate. Currently working in a department where we help with recruitment to clinical trials, so not so much of the complementary medicine, but really interesting all the same. In terms of my other roles, I'm one of the editors-in-chief for the European Journal of Integrative Medicine. I'm also a scientific board member for the National Centre for Integrative Medicine. That's the centre run by Liz Thompson, based in Bristol. And I'm a trustee at the Research Council for Complementary Medicine, or RCCM, which I'll talk a bit more about later. It's a charity which aims to facilitate research in complementary medicine across all different therapies, with the aim of making integration into the NHS more likely. So the presentation today is going to look at a few different areas, just a bit of an overview, and it's all based in my kind of experience and stuff I've read. So there's a lot more that we could have covered, but keeping it to half an hour or so. So firstly, I'll look briefly at some of the barriers to complementary medicine research, and then we'll look at some of the research design challenges. So when you're designing research in complementary medicine, what are some of the particular challenges around how you design that research? And then look at a few ideas about how to design studies when you're looking at complementary medicine. And briefly, I'll touch on the implementation of research. So that's kind of taking what you found when you've done a research project and trying to make sure it actually makes a difference or get used or gets implemented into healthcare or wherever you think it needs to be implemented, really. And then I'll very briefly mention barriers and solutions to integration, by which I mean the integration of complementary medicine into the NHS. Most obviously, all my work's been in the UK and around kind of the NHS. I realised some of you are international and working in other healthcare systems, so some of that stuff might be a bit less relevant. But hopefully, you'll find it useful and interesting. So I've got a slide here which just starts off talking about some of the barriers to complementary medicine research. And I just want to emphasise that much of this information has been inspired by a very recent paper from this year by Yasemin Beziari and Matthew Leach and colleagues. Their work is referenced at the end of the presentation, and their work is based in Australia and New Zealand, but a lot of the content really does still apply here in the UK, and I'm sure to other contexts as well. It's a really nice summary of some of the barriers which I've come across and which really resonate with me. So generally, they identified barriers and enablers, focusing on one of two broad constructs. So that was capacity and culture. So this first slide just outlines the capacity-related barriers. So these relate to issues that are amenable to change, albeit with concerted effort and resources. Whereas culture is perhaps more ingrained. And you can see the outline of the barriers here that they identified and a few that I've added, which I think are important. And these barriers are clearly interrelated. A lot of them, if you don't have one, you're unlikely to have the other. So, for example, the lack of funding for CAM research means that there are people doing it, so they don't get to become competent, and they don't be able to support others. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle in some situations. So just to go through them, obviously resources, we all think about funding as the main one, and I'll talk a little bit about funding towards the end of the presentation. But there's more to that in terms of research support, conduct of research and collaborations. So kind of the support and the resources that are out there for you to do research. And then relatedly, the issue of governance or leadership. So can professional bodies tend to generally focus on professional supporting professionals and practitioners rather than being involved in research. Although I will say my experience with the RCCM, many of them are really interested in research and they're making a really good effort in terms of trying to equip their members to do research and also doing research themselves. So it's definitely something on their agenda. It's just a case of priorities, I think, in terms of what to focus on using their limited resources. But compared to some of maybe the conventional professional bodies, the complementary medicine ones, possibly not as involved in research. And then from the other side, in terms of academics, there aren't a huge amount of complementary medicine academics in this country, certainly. I don't know if it differs in other countries. This is most likely a reflection of the reduction in higher education programs. As I said, I studied at Westminster. There were quite a few different programs running at that time. And since then, a lot of the courses have changed or have been closed down. So there isn't a huge body of kind of academic complementary medicine happening. There's a few of us, and we're enthusiastic, and we try and network up together and collaborate. But it's a small field, it's a niche field, as I'm sure you know. So there's that issue. Then there's obviously the issue of bias, which I'm sure you've come across, a barrier within universities, healthcare providers, and even maybe within literature databases. And it may mean that mainstream medics can't or don't want to collaborate, depending on who their employer is and what their attitude is. I've done a lot of work with GPs and primary care professionals, and the attitudes vary widely, as you'd expect. Some are perfectly happy with it, but some do have constraints in terms of what they're allowed to work with or what they feel is kind of valid. Time is always an issue, even worse now, I think, post the pandemic. A lot of complementary medicine practitioners are very tight on time and just trying to keep their practice going. So research might not be top of the list in terms of ways to spend their time and resources. Finally, the ethical approval issue. This is something that we come across a lot at the RCCM. And I would recommend that you read our latest blog, which was written by our very own Karen Charlesworth, and really just goes into a lot of the detail about being an independent researcher and how you can get ethical approval, which can be quite difficult if you're not attached to a university. And that's obviously something that's essential for research, and it can be an issue particularly for practitioners who are working on their own. So those were the issues of capacity. Then there's the other issue of culture. So this goes a bit more into detail of what I just mentioned before in terms of bias and values. So these are less amenable to change, I suppose, because they are kind of ingrained in people's belief systems. So the first one is the values of CAM, and this quote just comes from a study I did, which was the SCIM study I did with Debbie Sharp, and it's just talking about, it says, whether you could provide the range of services an osteopath would do privately within the NHS setting. It's a bit like trying to put a square peg in a round hole, so that you have this clash between complementary medicine and some conventional systems such as the NHS, and can you actually use the two together, given that they're coming from very different conceptual, philosophical backgrounds, which is quite a big issue and can cause some barriers to conducting research as well as practice, obviously. I'll talk about a bit more detail later about how complementary medicine is often a complex system, and not all research designs take that into account. As I mentioned, there is a bit of a lack of research culture in complementary medicine, and this kind of silo mentality where people tend to work often on their own or maybe within a profession, and there's not a huge amount of crossover between the disciplines. Collaboration or exchanging ideas, that can be a bit of an issue. And just further related to that really is this lack of unity. So not knowing who to contact, not having those connections that you really need in terms of collaborating on a research project. It's very hard to do a project on your own, as I'm sure some of you have tried to as a student. It is a lot of work, and it does work much better as a research team, which might not be readily available to complementary medicine practitioners. And there's sometimes can be a lack of kind of professional unity. So that's something that the RCCM is also working on in terms of being an umbrella organisation that covers a lot of different therapies. So that's something that we're trying to address and look across, because there's a lot of common issues and common agendas between different types of therapy. But a lot of the associations that I mentioned are just for one particular approach, so for acupuncture, for hypnotherapy, for nutritional medicine, and they all tend to work on their own. There's not a huge amount of cross-disciplinary collaboration or interaction. Another important lack of unity to mention here is between the CAM industry and other institutions or practitioners and universities. So that's something that is really important to us at RCCM, is trying to connect the practitioners and the professional bodies with universities, academics, people who are interested in doing research, because it works really well to do it that way, and just work as a team. But it's can be quite tricky to get those collaborations and connections going. So just moving on a bit more specific really about doing research in complementary medicine. As I'm sure you all know, most complementary medicine would be seen as a complex intervention. So compared to, say, a pharmaceutical medicine, which is very simple, it's just a pill, there's a lot more to most complementary medicine. So some of the issues that need to be considered when doing research, it's not to say you can't do research because of them, it's just things that may need a slightly different approach. So, for example, the individualized treatment that most approaches will use versus having treatment protocols. So, in research, you usually try to standardize the intervention as much as you possibly can. Obviously, in complementary medicine, many of them would use an individualized treatment, so it's actually impossible to standardize it. So just a different research design is needed, really. That's all. I'll talk about that a bit more detail. In terms of diagnosis, again, many use individualized diagnosis. So, for example, in Chinese medicine, it's not my specialist area, but I understand there's very different ways of doing diagnosis to in Western medicine, conventional medicine. So which do you use in terms of selecting your patients, and is that transferable across to the healthcare system that you're using, or that you want, where you want the research to be implemented? So that's in terms of how you select the participants. And then there's the practitioner-patient relationship and how much you take that into account. So different practitioners will work differently. They'll have a different relationship, and that's usually an integral part of the intervention. So how do you account for that in the research? The issue of blinding, which is when the patient would, or the participant would be unaware which arm they've been put into in terms of the research study. Obviously, almost impossible for most complementary medicines, apart from maybe more medicinal ones like herbal medicine or homeopathy, where it's a tablet. Something like acupuncture, quite difficult to blind someone to know whether they're having acupuncture or not, or something like yoga, even more difficult, where they're actually an active component of the intervention. And similarly, the idea of sham or placebo treatments is quite a tricky one. I know in acupuncture they have developed all sorts of placebo or sham needles that don't actually pierce the skin but give the impression that they are acupuncture, and I know there's a lot of debate about the usefulness of them, and that's something that we should be investigating further. The complex intervention I've mentioned, that just takes into account all the different aspects. So you might have something which is an intervention where someone's given something to take, but they're also given advice in terms of their diet. They might be given exercises to do. They might be, doing all sorts of things which all come together to form the intervention. So all of those different components are actually part of the intervention, but do you break that down, or do you look at the whole thing as a whole intervention, and how do you kind of standardize that across the research study. And then outcome measures. This is improving. There are lots of different outcome measures out there now. There's measures called the MIMOP and the MICOR, which are really popular in complementary medicine because they're what's called patient-generated outcome measures. So rather than specifying what you're trying to measure, so like pain or anxiety or any kind of symptom or sign, the patient can actually specify what's important to them and what it is that they want to measure, basically, which kind of aligns a bit better with some of the philosophies of some complementary approaches, in terms of it's not that everybody doesn't want to see an improvement in the same thing, or they haven't sought help for the same thing either. So it's just something to consider, which outcome measures you want to use. And it's always important to use ones which have been validated and standardized so that they are measuring what they say they're measuring. So just looking a bit more into kind of research design ideas. So there's various different proposals about how we can look at complementary medicine research, and how maybe we can view the overall, the system of research that we're using to look at it, given the limitations of the existing systems that we've just talked about. So Vinyar Fonabo and colleagues have suggested that the model of clinical research maybe needs to be almost flipped on its head for complementary medicine. So on the left of this picture here, you can see the traditional approach that would be used for pharmaceuticals that's been developed for drug research. So it's where you take a chemical, you look for a substance and how it would work biologically. So maybe in lab studies, and then you progress through the different types of trials. So looking at animal studies, maybe until you get into human studies and safety studies, and then implementing in clinical practice. If you think about most complementary approaches, this doesn't really work because you're not looking for a single agent and you can't kind of progress through that process. So what they're suggesting is that we flip that over, and if you start from the bottom right of this diagram, you can see you've already got the clinical practice. Most approaches are already being used in practice. It's not that we're trying to develop a new one, we're trying to work out if the ones that are already being used really work and maybe how they work. So kind of working backwards from that, so looking at what's in practice, kind of breaking it down in terms of what's the background to it, how is it being used in practice, looking at the safety, and then maybe comparing it to other approaches. And then you could move down into the more detailed, which are the actual components which are working, and then you could start looking at biological mechanisms of how those work. So you can see it's the same structure, but it's just in reverse. So it's quite a different approach. You can see how that might present some challenges when it's presented for funding in a funding application or protocols put together. It's quite a reversal of the usual process, and much of the research structures in terms of funding and support are based on this drug development pathway. So you're up against kind of an established way of doing things, I suppose. But it's not to say it's not unique to complementary medicine. As I'll mention in another slide, it applies to a lot of other interventions in conventional approaches, public health, or anything that's not a drug, really. So it's not unique to us, but is important. Something else which has gained a lot of traction recently in complementary medicine research is comparative effectiveness or pragmatic studies. So you can see it's kind of a scale of how you do studies, how you do trials, really. So in a trial, patients would be randomized to two groups, as I'm sure you understand. But what you compare between those two groups is quite different. So the traditional would be on the left there, where you compare to placebo, and that's to really determine what's called efficacy, so the very specific efficacy of the intervention or medication that you're testing. You're looking for very specific effects, and you're looking for an explanation of how it works and if it works. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum are effectiveness studies, where you're comparing maybe to usual care, and you're looking at the overall effects and using pragmatic trials. A pragmatic trial is where you compare a whole system or a whole intervention. So where I talked earlier about a complementary medicine intervention having lots of different components, and from the relationship to the advice given to the setting and everything. So you're comparing that whole package of care, and you're comparing that to another whole package of care. So whether that's usual care or NHS care or a different intervention. So you're looking at the overall effect of that whole package rather than trying to narrow down and say it's this part that's causing the effect or not. So it has pros and cons. Obviously, it's difficult to say what's causing the effect, and people often have a problem with that. And yeah, it's a bit harder to narrow it down. And you wouldn't expect this to be blinded because people will know what they're getting. So there's an example, a study from 2004 by Vickers et al. That was published in the BMJ. So this was acupuncture for headache, and patients were randomized to acupuncture in addition to standard care. So there was no, they received their usual standard care from the GP, and then they received up to 12 treatments over 3 months from a practitioner. And they specified the training that the practitioners had to have, and how long they've been practicing. And then the acupuncture point prescriptions as such were individualized to each patient and were at the discretion of the acupuncturist. So that really mimics usual acupuncture practice. And the ones who received usual care were told to avoid acupuncture. So they didn't receive any acupuncture, and they were encouraged not to seek acupuncture elsewhere. So you can see that's kind of like a real world study where practice is practiced as it is in the real world. And this third slide about research design shows you the MRC, so that's the Medical Research Council's Complex Interventions Research Framework. And this covers a range of interventions, like I mentioned earlier. So it could be public health interventions, it could be something about policy, maybe a welfare policy, or even something like surgeries. Anything which isn't really a medication and which has different components can be seen as a complex intervention. So the MRC recommend that this is used to evaluate complex interventions, that you consider each of the purple boxes and think about which of those is most relevant based on what's already known and what evidence would add to the knowledge about that intervention. And the parts in the red box are elements that should be considered for each stage. So feasibility, evaluation, implementation, developing the intervention. So it just depends which stage you're at for your intervention as to which kind of outcome, which kind of aim you need to have from those purple boxes. So this goes beyond asking whether it works and looks at a broader range of questions. So what impact does it have? What resources does it need, and is it worth it? Theorizing how it works, looking at how it interacts with the context in which it's implemented, and how it can be used to support real world decision making. So again, it's very much a real world kind of framework, quite the other end of the spectrum from basic science based in the lab. This is much more applied and relevant to practice. I just wanted to briefly mention the implementation of research. There's a whole lot more we could talk about here, but just to mention 2 studies. The first one, which is a little out of date now, was a study I did with some colleagues on clinical guidelines in complementary medicine and whether they recommend CAM or not. And we found that out of the NHS guidelines we reviewed, 44% were inconclusive. So those that mentioned complementary medicine, almost half of them couldn't draw a conclusion, mainly because of lack of evidence, but possibly for another reason. So they just say we can't recommend it or not recommend it. There's no conclusion. And those that did give a recommendation were equally split, really, in terms of recommending complementary medicine or advising against it. So that's quite interesting. The other study is a recent overview of acupuncture systematic reviews, and this found that of 77 diseases investigated, acupuncture showed a moderate or large effect with moderate or high certainty evidence for 8 different diseases or conditions, varying from fibromyalgia pain, lower back pain, dementia, rhinitis. But what they did find is instead of endorsement in health policies, which you'd expect from that kind of level of evidence, only a few healthcare systems had incorporated acupuncture into clinical practice and national healthcare health coverage for these conditions. So it's just showing that even if you have the evidence, there is a whole nother step in terms of implementation and getting that research to actually make a difference. And some of the barriers to the implementation are lack of access to research by the decision makers and maybe the practitioners. Can practitioners lack training on how to use research, so how to read and interpret it, how to explain it to patients, and their awareness of guidelines? And then there's a lack of incentive for evidence-based CAM practice. So CAM practitioners, as I said earlier, have a lot of different priorities, and research and using evidence, sadly, might not be a very high one for them. So very briefly, just to look at the integration into the NHS. These are some of the barriers that I've identified through my work. So NHS practitioners' lack of knowledge about complementary medicine and perceived lack of evidence. The pressures of working in the NHS, even more so. This was done pre-pandemic, but I can tell you even now the pressures are even more, aren't they? We all know that. Structural barriers, so the bureaucracy and the way things are set up in the NHS is a real problem in terms of integration. And there's just a couple of quotes there. You can say, this hypnotherapist talks about bashing their head against a brick wall trying to integrate into the NHS, even though they want to. And a GP just saying, we've got a lot of priorities, so where does this fit in? Just to highlight some of the positives. I know this presentation might sound like a lot of negatives. Obviously, evidence is one of the key facilitators to integration. GP education and attitude, so working with whether it's GPs in training at university or when they're in practice, trying to just raise awareness of your therapy and of complementary medicine and change those attitudes and knowledge. NHS future plans and guidelines. Often complementary medicine fits really well with some of the NHS objectives in terms of healthy living and sustainable healthcare and all of those. So if you can tap into those, it's a really good way to try and get integrated. And then obviously research training for CAM practitioners, which is what the NCA and RCCM and these other organisations are really, really working towards. Quick note about funding, which is something that people always cite as a big barrier. Start small, try to generate data from your routine practice, and encouraging results from a service evaluation can lead on to a feasibility study. It's a really good idea to just start small, just collect a little bit of data and see what you can do with that and grow from there. Funding is difficult to get, but I haven't actually experienced in my career any particular bias in terms of getting funding. If you put a good bid together, there's a lot of reasons you don't get funded, but I've never come across kind of a philosophical or a bias against complementary medicine. I think it's more about the capacity and the culture that I've been talking about. So the lack of structures and support available in complementary medicine. I've mentioned the Trojan horse approach, which is, maybe just, like I said, go on the back of policies which are supportive of the kind of approaches that we're using. You don't even need to name it as complementary medicine. You can change wording to suit. I have applied for the NIHR funding before. The Research for Patient Benefit is one of the programs which a lot of people get funding for complementary medicine. It's a huge amount of work to put together an NIHR bid. I spent a whole year writing a bid for a program grant which failed for various reasons about the study design, the choice of intervention, the talking about sham, that issue about sham that comes up again and again. External validity issues were mentioned as well about how would we ensure that our intervention was suitable or acceptable to a range of different people, and issues around implementation were raised as well. There are charities that support research, such as Dimbleby Cancer Care, Macmillan Cancer Again, and maybe small local charities are worth looking at. And then just finally a plug for the RCCM. I know I've mentioned it throughout. If you're interested in researching complementary medicine, I'd really advise you to join up as a member. It's £50 a year to join. We do have a student rate, which can give you a discount off that. And it's a really supportive community of complementary medicine researchers. We run events. We're running CamStrand this year in September, which I'll tell you more. You'll hear more about from me. And it's just a nice place to be able to exchange ideas and get support and discuss things with other people and access. Our website has a huge amount of resources on. And my final slide is just the papers I've mentioned throughout the presentation. So I hope that gives you a bit of insight into some of the challenges of complementary medicine research, but I hope it hasn't put you off, because as the future generation of complementary medicine researchers, we really need you guys to continue the good work that lots of other colleagues have been doing. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Please just get in touch.